Welcome to Forsyth's Elements, where we discuss the depth psychology of world formation. This is part 8, and this following few videos are going to we are going to look at what the ancient philosophers of the late period are saying exactly about the fantasies. We are going to focus on the definitions to see if we can weigh up against today's against what we have today. Now, self-knowledge and wisdom is always a unity of self in every human being. That self forms and accompanies every anger, every pleasure, every love, every guilt, and every beautiful thing. We have these opposite poles, contraries, to which we are, our passions might be involved. All knowledge, then, says the ancient people, a central teaching of Socrates, begins and ends with the self, and point of an evolution and a revolution, an evolution from within and a revolution around a greater self. There's no knowing without the self. The practice of the fantasy in times gone by was designed to get to know thyself, and echoes through time, particularly in the work of Socrates. Now, our imagination series, we think, is unique in that it captures particularly the thoughts on Phantasia. Might be a strange term for you to hear, but it's not really. It's actually a very ancient Greek word. It captures the wisdom on Phantasia of the ancients and of particularly the late Platonic works. We use geometric icons and many other images, such as these beautiful flowers, the plants, and things that we see, the water and the air in all our videos. We'll see that we have there's no accident in the images that I'm using on the screen. So this practice has been practiced for thousands of years in the mystery of Ulysses, a long time ago, and at a time when humans possessed a vastly different world view than in comparison with what we have today. At its foundation, the ancient cosmic myth recognizes that being, spirit, wholeness, the world, and the soul of man affords the expression of God and our interformation and interforming perceiving experience through nature herself. In this ancient cosmic worldview, it is uncertain as to when the genesis of the world really occurred. And here is what an ancient man, 600 BC, his name is Ocellus, here is what he says about that, about the psychology of the world that he found himself in. This is his writing. In this document is also a little obscure. I'll leave this link in there. Life connectedly contains in itself bodies, but of this, soul is the cause. Harmony, harmonics, comprehends connectedly with the world, but of this, God is the cause. Concord, binds together families and cities, and of this law is the cause. Hence, there is a certain cause and nature which perpetually adapts the parts of the world to each other, and never suffers them to be disorderly without connection. Our blue line through world that's connected to Mother Earth here. Aren't we wondering today how a whole human being can develop out of one single cell? But what does all this have to do with cosmic imagination and our human fantasy? We're going to have a look just what some contemporary people are saying about the fantasy. We'll have a brief look at their definitions. The first definition we'll check out is this one of Matt Siegel of Footnotes to Plato. Oops, I'm on the wrong screen.
Whitehead similarly has an ether theory. He calls it the ether of events, and he really wants to distinguish it from any kind of materialistic ether, which is what physics had been imagining pre-Einstein. And so I try to integrate these various understandings of the ether to suggest that we can imaginatively participate in this kind of etheric field, and through that field, a commonality, a common medium is established between what we call mind and what we call nature.
At certain junctures in the tracking, they'll come along and they lose the trail. And the person who's running and doing the gesturing will drop into enacting the animal, trying to take on the perspective of the animal, the way the animal, what the animal cares about, what the animal finds significant, trying to take on the identity of the animal, and then create this, right, sense of, from that, that is the way the animal went. This is the imaginal part of tracking. What's the distinction I'm invoking here? It's a distinction from Corbin between the imaginary and the imaginal. Both use the imagination. The imaginary uses images and takes you away from perception.
That gives us a good idea. I put the links to these two wonderful philosophers in the description below. For those who are interested in watching this, will be able to watch what is said there by these two gentlemen. Now, imagination, this is my own impressions that I'm giving here. Imagination is the inner passage of the human soul to a greater self-understanding, an inner passage that affords, through a lifestyle of contemplation, greater self-understanding, spiritual rebirth or purification, inner silence, exile. Moses was exiled into the desert. This exile is probably one of the oldest transformational ideas that involves the sacrifice, a giving up of yourself. I won't forget a long time ago when I started out on this path, I got to, I just had the feeling that I had to, the stuff I knew it served its purpose, and I needed to find something new. So I made a fire and I threw all my psychology books and all my other books and stuff that I had, because I've always been an avid learner. Threw it in there, and that was my ritual. I think that opened me to deeper inquiry, but I never realized the depth of exile and the profound lessons insight, perhaps revolutions of one's understanding one could gain from this. Plato says this is a silent contemplation without sounds or words, a lifestyle of vigilant attention. We have to learn to pay attention to our surroundings and what's happening. This is the essence of this internal practice of spiritual rebirth and the elevation of awareness and our souls. This is what I'd like to think of, and I came to understand in my writings, that this is the inner port. It's kind of a strange concept today because we don't have a concept that's that well developed of internal. And we think internal is a material concept. Well, we are going to have to grapple with that idea for a while. The inner contemplative passage, a life choice to engage within a deeper self-understanding. Sometimes life's a difficulty, as I intimated earlier. One's suffering and one's pain drives this choice to inquire. We begin with an explanation of these icons that we have, a kind of developed out of my thought about how to present our videos. And so I think it needs a little bit of explanation. Icons and symbols have always been with mankind. The first symbol was painted on the side of a cave wall by someone who, that was an intellectual revolution. I would like to think of putting a representation of something. It's like a bee building a hive. It's a representation of something that it's painted on a wall. That's what I mean. So in video 7a, we explain how we arrive at this icon that's here, this composite icon with its intermediate inner circles through the geometry of Proclus. Oops, I'm clicking on the wrong screen. Expanding this icon to a vertical structure like I did here, and later on I had the idea of making in SolidWorks these glass bowls. Well, they're not bowls, they're spheres, but in this dimension they look like a bowl. They are glass spheres, and I'm putting the sphere of the earth at the bottom here. This is our corporeal, the world that gives birth to us. So these icons that I have expanded into 3 dimensions should not be interpreted as a 3-dimensional relativistic image of space-time. Oops. Space has no subsistence in this icon, and time is both circular and instantaneous. And time is where form and formation is. Hence, the vertical dimension of our icons, represented here by the blue line, connected with the blue line, do not convey distance, but indicate cause and formation. But place, such as for instance the place of this moon here, place to which we will come to in the next few videos, is far more unexplored and very interesting work of Proclus. We think that these icons afford us some perspective upon the depths and psychological subtlety of the ancient fantasy. The blue through line, as we have said, represents Pythagoras' cosmic axis and poles, an upper pole and a lower pole. And this I made here as a note, a note before Plato is actually a note before Socrates. That time has many great and greater circular revolutions is indicated by the circles and glass spheres we have in this icon. All things that we have here seem to be not to be disparate with modern findings. And we also see here that these spheres in video 7, we've shown that you cannot form a sphere without a point or a radius. The best view then of our icons is that of cosmos, man and nature, living image, an expression of God. Before we launch into the definitions, which I find really interesting, and we'll be able to immediately see where they dovetail with our two friends we had earlier on in the beginning. We'll begin with Tolkien's admonition, or just his caution about the interpretation of myth, of ancient myth. He says, "The hasty survey finds only their wilder tales. A closer examination finds their cosmological myths. Only practice and inner knowledge discover their philosophy and their religion, that which is truly worshipful, of which, he says, the gods are not necessarily an embodiment at all, or only in a variable measure embodied." We find the same warning, rather admonition, is issued by Plutarch in 119 AD. Previously, in our previous videos, we said, this is the beginning of our stuff, we said in being, all forms is in one form. Being comprehends in one form all forms, all essences, and their instantaneous corporeal formation. We indicated that imagination or fantasia is a feminine energy and always is receiving, assimilating, and formative, bringing forth at once from within direct, instantaneous image formation within our own self-environment. We begin with these definitions and views in our fantasy, and views in a fantasy of Synesius in 373. This is kind of also an obscure, it took me a while to find this in the works of Taylor, and this quote is in the commentary of Proclus on the Elements of Euclid, which is also a fascinating read. He says, "For this fantastic spirit is situated in the confines of the rational and brutal nature. The rational nature towards the upper pole, the good, and the base nature is the nature of privation of external sense perception, and is of an incorporeal and a corporeal essence. The fantasy is the medium which conjoins the divine essences of natures and the lowest of all, because corporeal matter, sorry, I should put my glasses on. Again, the fantasy is the medium which conjoins the divine essences of natures with the lowest of all, the base the Haley matter, the base of Aristotle, and these inserts you see here are my own inserts to clarify. To which Simplicius, 100 years later, comments, and this comment is in H.J. Blumenthal's work, Simplicius on Aristotle's De Anima. Simplicius observes here, he says, is the interconnecting faculty between the purely external senses and the beginnings of reason. And as such, the fantasy shares the characteristics of both, being inward like the rational faculties and external like the senses and sense contact of the corporeal world. Simplicius calls imagination intellect, since sense perception no longer has anything in common with intellect in this respect. This is an important remark that we will come back in the third video from here when we weigh up which school of thought what belongs to, Aristotle's or Plato's or Pythagoras. On this account, says Synesius, to continue him, it is difficult to comprehend the nature of imagination by philosophical argumentation. The nature of Fantasia is to be sought for in the arcana of the mysteries. Synesius, he says, but it is requisite to banish all influxions, things from the external senses, before the fantastic spirit or imagination can superinduce the divinity. Whoever preserves the imagination pure according to nature will render it prompt for its most exalted employment. For, says he, this spirit understands the affections, the affordances of the soul, and is not destitute of sympathy towards it. Like its testaceous, earthy vestments, the gross material body, in Indian philosophy, there are, they have in the Vedanta, they had an admirable exposition of the different kinds of subtle bodies. We won't discuss this here, which has a condition opposite to the more excellent affordances of the soul. But the primary and proper vehicle of the soul, this fantastic spirit, is when the soul, let me read this, but the primary and proper vehicle of the spirit, when the soul is in a flourishing condition, is attenuated, that is to say, when it's converted from states of ignorance, when a person starts to inquire and learn the question why and what comes up, and I need to understand this thing to move forward, is also an aspiration of the fantasy toward the good. So the spirit says he becomes attenuated into a higher state of inquiry or awareness, and it becomes ethereal. We see that Mark Siegel mentioned the ethereal idea of the ethereal in his video at the beginning of this session of ours. But when the soul is badly affected, says he, that is to say, unexercised, neglected through oblivion of privation or ignorance, then the vehicle is dulled and becomes earthy. To which earthy meaning accepting the external world of sense for what it is and for what it is. There isn't another description. Which Proclus observes, but the best education of our imagination consists in always energizing, in looking to, in always, this energizing should be seen in the way of aspiring higher to a higher grasp, higher order intellect, consist in energizing according to an intuitive, intelligent, and internally receptive projecting power. We don't know if this is the meaning of Immanuel Kant when he talks about intuition. Oops, I'm on the wrong screen again. And in taking care that the principal energy of the soul is always intellectual. Always aspire to the good. But in higher order intellectual perception, such as we have here, above all things, separates whatever is contrary, what is opposing to the true purity of the fantastic spirit or light. So the fantasy brings forth, here we place the fantasy in the middle here, at once unity from contraries in this inquiry. For, says Proclus, a higher intellect attenuates through conversion the fantasy, the spirit, in a hidden or subtle and ineffable manner and extends it to divinity. The soul is most divine. And when it becomes adapted to this exalted energy, says he, of light or internal perception, it draws by a certain affinity, similarity, or similitude is the word, of nature, a divine spirit, intelligence, into conjunction with the soul. A little closer to our time, Thomas Taylor gives us this definition of the late Platonic imagination or fantasy. Taylor says, Fantasia is morphotique noesis. I don't know if I pronounce that correctly, but there you have it. Noesis, noetos, intelligible, figured intelligence, because all the perceptions of those intellectual powers of intelligence are inward and not external, like those of the sense, and are accompanied with figure. In other words, intelligence is accompanied with figure. Well, it is figure itself. Morphe, form, or figure and form, is the embodiment of essence. Essence and form is the same in the intelligible world. The embodiment of essence and intelligence with form. But the form is a subtle form. It's not, there is intermediate worlds here, which we briefly touch in on video 6 and the 2 videos 7 and 8 for those who are interested, would be interested in perusing those. So, to begin again, the embodiment of essence is an intelligence with form, but it's a subtle form. As forming image or figure itself, the fantasy is the image of the supreme rational soul. Priscianus, in his observations on Iamblichus in the 3rd century, says the fantasy is twofold. The fantasy is produced alongside all the principal faculties of the soul, being life, spirit, higher intellect. In this icon we have essential forms. We have the fantasy receive likenesses of form, and here we have the corporeal world, external body, and corporeal sense. All and receives a psychical impression from all the likenesses of essential forms which we had up here, and transmits, intellectually converts the appearances of some to other faculties, rousing some from external sense contact, sense perception, to opinion, and a second set from an interior, higher intellect to opinion, because the fantasy is the bridge, the passage between internal and external knowledge. Priscian continues, hence, the fantasy is appropriately characterized in accordance with assimilation in image making and receiving what belongs to either intellectual or generative or median operation. Intellectual, higher order intelligence. Pythagoras places and Orpheus places intelligence at the end of the intelligible order, and there are many divisions of these which we won't come to in this video or in the next two. So the fantasy is appropriately characterized in accordance with assimilation in image making and receiving what belongs to either intellectual, the upper pole, or generative, the lower pole, or median, the intermediate world, and receives the impressions from all activities of the soul, and is established as a special property of the soul in its assimilative ability. He says, Fantasia conjoins through contact. We've seen contact in our previous videos. Through external with internal activities, energies. Through contact with both. And bestowing on lives extended around bodies, corporeal appearances, the likenesses of essence descending from intellect. This refers to cosmic formation, cosmic world formation. This view of Priscian of Lydia, he continues the work of Theophrastus, a student of Aristotle, is a cause for pause. In my opinion, this is probably the most overlooked principality in all of late Platonic philosophy. The fantasy, says Priscian, is neither passion nor motion. Imagination is an indivisible and determinate activity. Without division, in other words, not separate. It is unlike the representation of wax or images pressed by instruments on stamps, and is not molded by receiving something from outside, such as when bees form their combs from wax. But the fantasy is roused to select images internally through the projection or bringing forth emanation of its simulative causal principles. Now, here we have an interesting confluence of contradictions, because Descartes observes in his meditations, he says, I must therefore admit, this is with respect to wax, I must therefore admit that I cannot ever comprehend by imagination what the piece of wax is, and that it is the mind alone which perceives it. He says, and now I'm saying, I wonder what the Dark Ages and the scholastics did to late Platonism and Aristotle. It seems to me that late Platonism has been pretty much ignored, but more later about that. The fantasy indeed fashions, forms, and expresses the energies of the soul. Imagination is moved not only when sense impressions are present, but sometimes have to be moved many times, such as, for instance, when we learn something. We have to go over the same work many times to become familiar with the principles of the work. But once the fantasy is moved, it can project or bring forth form images in accordance with their reference to the forms that moved it originally. We observe the assimilative and receptive fantasy or imagination is the principle of all image formation and contact. The medium of the fantasy affords formative image formation in the perception or cognition of all animals. Contact, figure, color are irreducible qualities inherent to image formation and soul. Unities, in other words, wholeness. Of harmonics, vision, formation, and spirit. All this contact, figure, and color is before quantity. See video 7b, I think, where we treat of this idea. We sum from Priscianus, from Priscian of Lydia. Imagination is the first contact and ruling principle of image formation within our perception, says he, to which we add image formation, a wholeness or irreducible unity within our at once forming self-environment or perception. It's an instantaneous through formation indicated by our Pythagorean through axis in blue. An orientation to Plotinus, who is next. Sight, says he, is the principal desire of seeing, to see, to be, and to become. And we say to see or looking is to bring forth, to form. Looking is the bringing forth of form and the manifestation of form. Our looking is essentially formative of the environment of the self. In other words, the environment and the self is one unity. Plotinus says intellectual perception is generated posterior to the subsistence of the good. Here we have the good, an intelligible sight, posterior to the good. Intellectual perception, iconically, we've placed it around here. And moves itself. Intellectual perception moves itself, says he, toward the good because it knows the good. Intellectual or spiritual perception, pneuma, is a motion towards the good and an aspiration, a desire after it. The fantasy desires after it because she aspires to the good. In real being, says Plotinus, to perceive intellectually, to live and to exist are consubsistent. If therefore it is being, it is also intellect, and if it is intellect, it is being, and if it is being, it is life, and if it is life, it is also being. A unity. Real being, one form, to perceive, to live, to exist, is a unity. True existence, therefore, says he, is full when it receives the form of essence, of intellectual perception, knowing, and of life. And, says he, intellectual perception is simultaneous with existence, with being, life, and spirit as a whole unity. One form, true being, true existence, and illumination from within the good, a whole of wholes of Proclus. Hence, says Plotinus, among the forms contained in true beings there are man and the intellectual perception of man, horse and the intellectual perception of horse, the just in the Republic and the intellectual perception of the just, the beautiful and the spiritual perception of the beautiful, truth and the intelligent perception of truth. These terms all mean the same thing. All things are double, says he, or two, incorporeal, macrocosm, and corporeal, microcosm. On the internal formation of the conceptions of the Dianoetic power, memory and imagination, he remarks this. But reasoning, that is to say, thought, dianoia, evolving and educing upwards, educing into the fantastic spirit or imaginative power from each conception, exhibits, projects, emanates, brings forth the conception as a resemblance, form, appearance, or a mirror reflection. And thus the apprehension, permanency, and remembrance, the memory of the images instantly formed, are effected. Reasoning and scientific investigation moves our corporeal intelligence. Hence, says he, the soul is always moved to intelligence. When she perceives intellectually, then the apprehension of what is perceived is produced in us. For intelligence is one thing, and the apprehension of intelligence is another. This we get from his discussion of the doubt relative to the soul. There is a link below. And we do always perceive, says he, Plotinus, intellectually, but we do not always apprehend that we do so. Thus, says he, this, says he, is because the recipient, the phantasy, the medium of formation, not only receives internal intellections, but also receives the external senses, internal perceptions, projections, or intellections, our self-knowledge and inner ascent along this path, along this way, the passage to greater self-awareness. The fantastic assimilating powers not being separate, like intellect, the intellectual powers, but from that which is the more excellent of the two prevailing, that is to say, either external or internal. Internal is the object of practice, the goal of practice. Oops, I clicked on the wrong thing. He says, from external and internal, says he, one phantasm, true appearance, former image is produced when these are in symphony. Since the one follows the other like a shadow and is subservient to intellect like a lesser to a greater light. That is to say, imagination follows upward reason and intelligence. Porphyry in 233 says this of the phantasy. The phantasy or spiritual or imaginative soul is the wings of the soul. For the soul passes its course through lives of this twofold nature, to incline to the supreme or to darkness, he says, hence too, this animal spirit, the soul spirit, the fantasy, which divine men have described as a spiritual soul, becomes a god, an omniform angel, or an image through which the soul suffers the punishment of its guilt. And the darkest, says Orpheus, of desires in Hades. Orpheus connects guilt with separation. That I found really interesting, the guilt of separation that needs to be healed. And says he, preceding lives are like a preparation for those to come. Of course, this is a controversy. On ancient theurgic practice, he says, the aim of which is the purification of the intellectual fantasy in the practices of Ulysses. He says this, nor decline beneath into the obscure world, beneath into the dark world of darkness, whose depth is always unfaithful, an unfaithful bottom. In other words, there's no end to the bottom. I don't know if you've experienced this, that you think things can't get any worse than it is now, and then it does. And an infernal darkness, squalid, rejoicing in shadows, and full of stupidity. What are these dark things in us? I think we are all familiar with those. Hate, fomenting, violence through advertising, influencing of any kind, killing, war, deceit, especially self-deceit, graft, the intentional distortion of truth through surreptitious and stealthy, underhanded operations, fomenting through manipulating the passions of others. Taylor observes this on an ancient practice. This practice, he says, of Ulysses consists of purifying the imaginative spirit or vehicle of the soul, which according to its various condition, that is to say, the various gradation of material complexity. There are many intermediate gradations of matter. So, let's not blame the imaginative spirit immediately for being dirty. The thing of it is, this is a statement of the effects of privation, of separation and division. So, it's really our own intellect that needs to become aware, that needs upliftment, and the fantasy always looking to the good, because there's no separation, pulls the soul up to intellectual conceptions, to greater awareness. That's the idea behind what I'm saying here. So the fantasy can either elevate the soul to a greater, superior state of understanding, awareness, or draws it down into the darkest recesses of the earth, Hades, of which the Bible, I think in Matthew 13, I think, says the same thing. Does it not seem to you that here we are unfolding from the works of wise men, such as the inimitable Mark Seagull and John Verveeke, for instance, and their definitions, and of course these lost definitions of the fantasy, all that we get all in one place here in this video series, never been done before, I think. Does it not seem that this is worthy of our attention. The dialectic movement of Plato to the good is a rising of awareness, a deeper awareness of the knowledge of myself. Especially in a time where we appear to have lost our rudder and inner compass to the deeply divine aspects of ourselves, our world, and our souls. There's only a few philosophers today, in my estimation, that have had the conviction of their soul to address these issues. For those, we should be grateful. Indeed, the world of later Platonists is deeply undergirded by a deeper and more ancient cosmic forming mythology, of which not much appear to have been said in modern philosophical circles. We will continue this investigation in part 9. Thank you for watching and your patience. You should probably watch this video a couple of times, leave it alone, come back 5 years from now, investigate the links, start reading, train your attention.